Hello, class. My name is Mr. Applequist. Today we are going to be discussing the principle of movement in art. We've already talked about several other principles before. We've talked about contrast, unity, balance, emphasis. Today we are talking about the principle of movement. So I'd like you to take a few minutes to think about this question. What do you think movement means when we are talking about sculptures and paintings that cannot actually move? So take a minute to write down your response to that in the Pear Deck. Then we will discuss and share your responses. Like I said, after a few minutes. So we're going to move on from there and talk about what you guys think movement means when we're talking about sculptures and paintings that can't actually move. So remember, we're talking about the principles of art. We've already talked about the elements of art. The elements of art are the building blocks, the ingredients that we use. And the principles are like the recipe that we follow if we're trying to make a finished dish, a meal. They're a guide that we follow. So they're not necessarily rules that you have to follow. They are a guide that tell us how to use the elements to get a certain effect. If we want the viewer to focus on something or draw their attention of something, we want to use contrast or emphasis. If we want them to feel relaxed, we want to use, pattern and repetition to make it look like something predictable and calming. So the principles of art that we've already talked about, like I said, contrast, unity, balance, emphasis, variety. Today we're talking about movement. So I made it in italics. Italics kind of looks like it's moving to the right, it's kind of got like that energy to it. So let's take a look at the 5 ways that we can create movement. First, let's get a little bit of a definition though. Movement is the principle of art used to create the impression of action in a work of art. So really what I want you guys to understand is that movement in artwork isn't actual things moving and turning and actually, we're not talking about actual movement. We're talking about the impression of movement. In all these cases, we're just getting the idea. Some sculptures might be able to actually move. They have, hinges and like moving pieces. But for the most part, we're talking about still sculptures and paintings that have the impression of movement. They remind us of movement. So 5 ways to create movement in artwork: repetition, dynamic lines, contrasting colors, implied movement, and eye movement. So does anyone know what repetition is? Repetition is repeating. It's really just like it sounds. Repetition and repeating sound similar. They are. Repetition is something repeating in the picture. Next, we're going to talk about dynamic lines versus static lines. Dynamic lines just remind us of movement because they're not static, but we'll get into the definition when we see that. Contrasting colors, we already talked about. Remember, contrasting colors kind of have that energy. Something light versus something dark really draws your attention, draws your eye. That's why they use it in advertisements. Then we have implied movement. Implied movement is just like it sounds when something looks like it's moving. So then next we have eye movement, which is probably the one you're least familiar with. Eye movement is when your eye is kind of not necessarily forced, but guided around the picture. The artist is guiding you around the picture it was their original intention. So it's usually not a mistake. The artist has kind of constructed the whole picture based on something that doesn't always make a cyclical motion, but oftentimes it is a cycle that kind of makes you go from the emphasis to the corners to another side, then back to the emphasis and going up in a triangle or a circle, something like that. So what is this? What is this an example of? We have the 5 ways. What is this an example of? How is this demonstrating movement? This is an example of repetition, repeating. Remember, we have the lines repeating. One on the left is a photograph. The one on the right is actually a drawing inspired by the photograph. The one on the left kind of has some photo manipulation. It looks like multiple people walking. You might not even recognize that. In any case, even if you don't recognize that they're people, the repeating lines give us the idea of motion, of movement. So both of these are an example of repetition, and both give us the impression of movement. So, like I said, the one on the left is a photo by Etienne Jules Maurice, and the one on the right is a photo, or is a drawing inspired by the photo. So next we're going to talk about static lines versus dynamic. So static, the word, means stable, stagnant, motionless, and dynamic talks about movement, characterized by constant change, activity, progress, movement. So when we're talking about creating movement with lines, static is going to be the opposite. Static means that it's still lines. Reminds us kind of like architecture, stillness, stable. They're going to be vertical lines, going up and down, or horizontal lines going left to right. Only vertical and only horizontal lines, and they're going to keep the same thickness throughout. They're not going to go from thick to thin like we have the lines over here on the right side. So we have curvy lines over here, and then we also have some tapered lines that go from thick to thin. So in both of those cases, we have lines that are dynamic. Anything that is not static is going to be a dynamic line. Zigzags, curves, diagonal lines, anything that is not vertical or horizontal and keeping the same thickness throughout, anything that is not that is going to be considered a dynamic line, reminding us of movement. So this karate guy, are the lines behind the karate guy static or dynamic? We have multiples of them, so there's definitely reminds us of movement because we have that repetition going on, but they're also at a weird angle. So they're at a diagonal angle, they're slightly curved, and they kind of taper actually too, if you notice. It looks like they're a little bit thicker in the middle and thin at the ends. So for all those reasons, those are an example of dynamic lines. Next, we have contrasting colors. So we've got these bright neon green colors and this bright neon orange color contrasting or overlapping with this kind of these dreary browns and muddy colors, very dull colors. So we have this bright, vibrant colors overlapping with these dull, dreary, muddy colors. And when we have that contrast going on, again, it draws our attention, gives us high energy. That difference really reminds us of the movement. So when we have these opposite colors in some ways, bright, bright, high-key colors versus low-key, dull colors, then we get this energy created. It's the illusion of energy. It's not actual scientific energy, but it draws our attention, creates the idea of movement. So next we have implied movement, the illusion of movement or symbolic gesture representing movement. So back to this karate guy, he looks like he's floating through space. He's got those comic book swoosh lines going behind him. It really looks like he's moving through space because we have that kick and because we have that empty background and we have those energy lines behind him. But then we also have this one that looks a little more realistic on the left, a little more photographic. Still a painting, but looks more realistic with this dancer who looks like she's about to fall over or continue the dance. It's up in the air. I mean, it looks like she's a skilled dancer, so she's probably just going to keep spinning. But right now, it looks like she's balancing on one foot, which she can't actually do. So not in that pose, at least. So we have that implied movement, like she's going to continue moving. She's not going to stay frozen there. And last, we have eye movement. So remember, eye movement is when your eye is kind of guided around the picture, kind of pre-set up, by the artist. It is not a mistake that this happens. He has decided in advance that he wants your eye to follow this path. So we have the ladies over here with the triangle, kind of just, again, goes in this continuous pattern. Then we have this angel over here, which is kind of composed of diagonal lines. So we have the one sweeping diagonal line that goes from one end to the other, but then we have these other ones that kind of represent the wing, and then it has the person that he is crushing or standing on. Then we have Starry Night. Looked at it a few times for different reasons. We're going to look at it for movement now. We have those swoosh lines, that moving wind swirling in the background. That kind of draws our attention to the center first. And then we go around and get towards the hills. And we go down towards the town, follow the edge of the hills towards the town, then go back up to this other point of emphasis, the trees, that big dark tree in the front, then back to the sky in this continuous pattern. So whether you were drawn to the tree first or the swirling sky, doesn't matter. You're going to keep going around in this cycle. That's the eye movement. This is just another way that pictures can be laid out. The Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio, this seashell shape. You'll see it often just as a basis for a lot of drawings, so keep an eye out for it. So now we're going to take a look at some classic paintings and pictures, and you guys are going to decide, is there any evidence of movement? So this is a... sorry, my type got a little, I think, messed up here, but his name is Theodore Géricault. It looks like Géricault, but it's pronounced Géricault. The Raft of the Medusa is a painting by him. So does this painting represent movement? Does it have evidence of movement? Any of the 5 ways? So decide right now on Pear Deck. You guys are going to answer, and be prepared to back up your answer when I call on you. All right? Back it up with one of the 5 ways. Make sure that you have evidence. So let's take a look at, yes, does this picture represent movement? Does it demonstrate movement? Yeah, it goes right up into the corner over here. It's pointing up to the corner over here where the flag is being waved. We're going to talk a lot more about this picture tomorrow because I love this picture. But yeah, right now we kind of come over here, start in the corner, and go all the way up towards the flag and that they're waving. And that's kind of the implied movement with the waving flag. But then we also have this eye movement that's going around in this continuous cycle following these 2 pyramids, the bodies stacked on top of each other. The sail is the secondary pinnacle of the pyramid. So, like I said, we'll talk a lot more about this tomorrow, but definitely an example of movement, a few examples of movement. What about here? Any examples of movement? This great wave, I believe it's called the Great Wave of Okinawa. I could be getting that wrong, but it's definitely the Great Wave of, I believe it's Okinawa. So, is there movement? Yes, I would say there is movement. We have these repeating kind of like sharp, jagged edges at the crest of the wave. Then we have these repeating lines inside the wave. We have the repeating boats. We have the repeating kind of dots of mist coming off the water. So a lot of repetition going on, but then we also have the implied movement of this giant wave that's about to crash. So we have that implied movement, we have repetition, definitely a lot of examples of movement going on here. What about this guy? The Thinker or Thinker by Rodin, a sculpture. So I would say this does not represent movement too well. He's pretty stagnant. It's pretty still. So definitely a sculpture that doesn't really represent movement. Sculptures can definitely, there are some dynamic sculptures that look like they're going to leap off of the pedestal. This one I would not say is one of them. Then we have Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. We already kind of talked about that, the swirling in the sky. Then we have the swirling in the sky. Then we have the kind of eye movement going up to the top, back down to the town, back to the tree in this cycle. Then we haven't really talked about this guy, Banksy. He's got some implied movement going on here. He's about to throw that, it looks like, right? So it looks like he's loading up to throw that. I believe this is called Flower Bomb, or there's another name for it. But yeah, this is a work by Banksy. So he's pretty popular current artist. Then we have The Scream by Edvard Munch. So I would say there's movement going on in the swirling background. There's the movement. He's got the kind of Home Alone look going on. So definitely swirling, repeating lines, especially here. So definitely movement going on. And then we kind of have another one by Banksy, We have that dynamic line. We have the implied movement in her hair, the balloon floating away. So definitely an example of movement. So I'd like you guys to just review this quick thing about asymmetry. Remember, yesterday we talked about balance. So informal balance means that it has asymmetry and equal visual weight. So the picture is not like a butterfly, the same on both sides, but it does have the same amount of visual weight on both sides. So like this example in the top over here, not the same exact picture on both sides of the axis, but they are about the same visual weight. Or if we have something close to the edge and then we have something right in the center, that's another way of creating informal balance with asymmetry. Again, two examples of asymmetry. This one looks, again, like they have equal visual weight because they're about the same size, but they're not perfect matches of each other. Same thing with here. We have the woman balanced with the painter. Same thing with here. We have something large balanced with something small by the edge. So different ways of creating asymmetrical balance. So your project is to create movement and informal balance in a single picture. So we already talked about informal balance yesterday, asymmetry with similar visual weight. Remember, two ways to do that. Either have them be the same visual weight or have something large in the center and something small towards the edge. So you guys are going to draw a picture that demonstrates informal balance and movement. We talked about movement today. So you have those 5 ways of creating movement, which I've kind of summarized right here: repetition, dynamic lines, contrasting colors, implied movement, and eye movement. So you guys have the rest of class to draw this picture with Chrome Canvas and upload it by the end of today at 4 o'clock. That is when it's due. So you guys can do that, and let me know if you guys have any questions.